Welcome back. Calls for a stronger coordinated national logistics strategy and political diplomacy have emerged as the 30% US tariff comes into effect. This comes as Maersk will discontinue its direct shipping service from South Africa to the US from October. Let's chat about this with Chief Economist at Econometrix, Dr Azar Jammine. A very good evening to you, Dr Jammine. And I guess you know what they say. When it rains, it pours. Well, at least that is the case for the South African economy when it comes to relations with the US, considering higher tariffs, possible AGOA exclusion. And now, as of October, the world's largest integrated container logistics company will no longer have that link that's direct between South Africa and the USA. If you could just tell us how this move will impact South African trade.
This is an unfortunate move for our trading with the United States because it means that South African goods going to and from the United States have to go through an additional stoppage in probably somewhere in Europe, and that will delay the transport of those goods to and from the country and increase the costs involved in doing so. So from that point of view, it makes South African trade with the United States that much less competitive over and above the 30% tariffs that are due to be imposed on some of the goods that we export to the US. I suppose the only consolation is the fact that our trade with the United States that is not subject to that is subject to the 30% tariff is relatively small in relation to our total trade with the rest of the world. So, it's not going to affect all our trade with the rest of the world by any means, but for that amount that is transshipped to the United States and probably to North America more generally, and possibly even South America, it will increase the costs thereof. But as I say, fortunately, the majority of our trade is with Europe and Asia and the Middle East and the rest of Africa. And to that extent, the costs of that trading are unlikely to be affected too much by this.
And that's encouraging to hear as well. But, Doctor, when we also look at the strained relationships between the South Africa and the USA in recent months and years as well, one also wonders with this next move by Maersk as well, it just seems to be compounding. Where does this ultimately leave the economic relationship between these two countries? Because it just appears to be that it's getting even more dire.
Obviously, the economic relations between South Africa and the United States are not favorable, but I would suggest that we are not the only country that is in that predicament at present. Other BRICS countries, including especially Brazil and India, find themselves in similar predicaments. And proportionately, certainly with Brazil, its trade with the United States is far bigger than that of South Africa with the United States. So I think one needs to put it into perspective before one panics and sees this as a devastating blow. Look, it is a blow. It is not going to help trade with the United States, and especially, one thinks in terms of the fact that some of our agricultural products are now going to be lumbered not only with the tariffs of 30%, but on top of that additional transportation costs. And I'm thinking especially of fruit, because a lot of it fresh fruit, it becomes it'll take that much longer now to reach the United States, and therefore become that much less attractive for the US to import that fruit.
And just staying with agriculture as well, of course, we've heard from citrus farmers as well who will be impacted. Also, when it comes to the possible exclusion of AGOA, when we're looking at these transshipments as well, which also usually take longer, as you've mentioned too, but also the freshness of the product, the quality of the product as well. Do you think that South African businesses in the agri sector that are exporting to the United States will be able to survive these conditions?
I'm confident that they will be able to survive these conditions, because you've got to bear in mind that the amount of production that goes to the United States, for most of them, is relatively small. I'm talking about less than 10% of all that they produce actually is earmarked for the exportation to the US. So to that extent, they will lose some market, or stand to lose some market, but it's not, they are not producing totally just for the United States. I think the one sector that is likely to feel it most is macadamia nuts, where 20% of exports go to the US. But again, nuts probably can bear a delay a little more than fresh fruit.
And Dr. Jammine, one of the solutions that is still on the table is the Mediterranean Shipping Company, which says, you know, they will be adding additional ships for this direct service between South Africa and the US as well. Will MSC be able to keep up with that demand of that direct shipment, do you think?
I do believe they'll be able to keep going and will be able to cope with the additional demand. I'm not quite sure just how many additional ships they're going to put available, whether that will be sufficient to cope with all the potential loss of trade that might otherwise have been incurred. But I think that is an example of why one shouldn't panic, because there are some possible solutions to this.
And just finally, of course, the big J word, jobs all the time. How, apologies there, how will this impact jobs?
As I mentioned, to the extent that, excuse me, South Africa fails to compensate with additional markets and is forced to reduce production of some of these goods, that will impact negatively on jobs at the margin. But again, just to emphasize, our exports to the US are not the be-all and end-all of our production in those particular industries. And for example, with cars, this is likely to have relatively minimal impact because cars don't rot over a long period of time. But certainly with fresh fruit, there will be some cost and probably some jobs. But I think people are exaggerating the extent to which jobs will be lost as a result of these sanctions. Producers of a lot of fruit have alternative strategies to try and compensate for this. And I think that we will see many of those coming into play. If this had been a cessation of logistics going to Europe or China, for example, I would have found it far more serious than is the case with just going to the US alone.
Quite encouraging to hear. I'm going to let you go, Dr. Jammine Azar, so you can get some water for that cough. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights. That was Chief Economist at Econometrix, Dr. Azar Jammine.